Hello, and welcome to a tutorial on how the Navy works in Victoria 3. This is the second part of a previous video that covered the Army, together covering the entirety of how the military works. There's a link in the description for the first one. In this video, I'm going to go over the basics of how to set up a Navy, what the Navy is used for, and how to figure out how many convoys it costs you to send an army overseas. Before I dive into the basics of setting up your Navy, I think it's worth it to first talk about what the purpose of your Navy is. The purpose of your Army is self-explanatory. You want to take land, you want to defend land, you need armies to do that. But you can't own the sea, so you first have to think about what the purpose of your Navy is. In the previous video, I talked about how Victoria 3 is a game geared mainly towards your economy. However, an economy is something that touches every aspect of your country, which is why the military is such a vital part of the game. But since the game is focused on the economy, your biggest concern with your military is how to supply that army. The purpose of your Navy is to make sure your army and your country stays supplied during wartime. I'll get into more detail on how you keep your soldiers and your country supplied, but first, let's look at how you set up a Navy. Let's look at this British Navy named the North American and West Indies Station. Just like with the Army, if you look at the outlier to the right, you'll see two numbers for each Navy. The first number is how many flotillas you have in that Navy, and the second number is how many flotillas your commanders in that Navy can handle without incurring a penalty to organization. Just as armies have battalions, navies have flotillas. So think of the word flotillas to represent a single naval unit. Unlike army generals, naval commanders have a base organization of 20 flotillas. So when you hire a new commander, they can organize up to 20 flotillas. You can then promote them, just like with generals, and they can organize more. So let's click on this commander, and you can see Sir George Cockburn is the lowest rank of naval commander at Commodore. So he can organize 20 flotillas. But if we look at the Navy named Portsmouth Station, and we look at their commander, so they can have up to 100 flotillas in this Navy. That's because Sir Edward Codrington has the highest rank of commander, that is Grand Admiral. Let's look at the numbers at the top. These are the same as we saw with the Army. So the first number is the total number of flotillas in this Navy. The next number is the manpower. Just like with the Army, manpower is probably the most important number here. This is how many individual sailors you have in this Navy. Two navies with similar numbers of flotillas, but drastically different numbers of manpower, will have very different results. The main way that you have two navies with the same number of flotillas, but drastically different manpower, is if the Navy has taken casualties. If you send a Navy against another, and they both have similar numbers of flotillas, but one has much lower manpower, the one with the higher manpower will have a severe advantage. The next number is the morale. Same with the Army. If morale is low, the Navy will have a higher chance of retreating from the battle. The next number shows you how much this Navy is costing you. When you hover your mouse over it, you will see the cost of the goods. Lowering the cost of the goods will lower the cost of the Navy. The next two numbers are your offensive and defensive score. Along with manpower, these are probably the most important numbers. When in a battle, one Navy is on offense and one is on defense. Depending on which one you are, one of these numbers will be used. The last number is organization. Usually this number is lowered when you add new flotillas. The number will go down and then increase as the new sailors are integrated into the Navy. This will also go down if your total number of capital ships and support vessels are more than your total number of light ships. And lastly, this number will go down if you have more flotillas in this navy than your commander can organize. Which brings us to the unit types. Navies have 3 types of units: light ships, capital ships, and support vessels. Unlike with armies, you don't start out with the 3rd type of unit until you research submarines. At game start, you start out with frigates and man-of-wars. Just like with armies, your 2nd and 3rd units can't be more than your 1st. So you can't have more capital ships and support vessels combined than you have light ships. You'll notice there's only one number underneath the unit types. That's because you can't have naval conscripts. In regards to the ratios of ships, there's not as much you need to consider as you do with an army. In the previous video, I went over the ratios of the 3 unit types depending on what you're going to use that army for. When it comes to navies, especially since for a large part of the game, you're only going to have the 2 unit types, and the second one can't be more than the first, you'll usually want to keep these 2 unit types equal in number. At base level, a commander can organize 20 flotillas, so you'll want 10 frigates and 10 man-of-wars. But you can also have more frigates than man-of-wars as well. These ratios will really depend on how many man-of-wars you have in your market. To make things complicated, the term man-of-wars is the name for the input resource for these ships, but as you can see, it's also the name of a unit. When you look at the resource requirements for each unit, you see frigates only require 1 unit of man-of-wars, whereas a man-of-wars unit requires 3 man-of-wars resources. So the ratio here really just depends on how many man-of-wars resources do you have in your market. Something that does make the Navy a little simpler is that, unlike armies, there's only one building that's supplying your navies, the military shipyard. However, the fact that there's only one building type supplying the navies makes upgrading a little complicated. When you look at the next unit upgrade for your capital ships, you'll see ironclads doesn't require an input of man-of-wars, but instead 3 units of ironclad resources. Again, making the unit type and the number of resources the same name. The same goes for the next upgrade to your light ships. The next unit is called monitors, and it no longer requires man-of-wars, but instead 1 unit of ironclads. Ironclads are resources you'll also make in the military shipyards. Looking at the military shipyards building, you'll see this one is set to making man-of-wars. If you look at the 3rd production method, steel hulls, you'll see production in this building will switch to ironclads. And here is the complication with upgrading your navy. A military shipyard can only produce man-of-wars or ironclads, not both. If we look at the tech tree, you'll see when you get the tech ironclad, it will now allow you to make ironclads in your military shipyards and upgrade your capital ships to ironclads. But it doesn't unlock monitors. Monitor is the next tech down. So you run into the issue of unlocking ironclads, but you can't just jump into upgrading your capital ships just yet. This is because if you upgrade your capital ships to ironclads before you research monitors, you'll now need input goods of monitors and man-of-wars. But your military shipyards can only make 1, so you have a couple of options to think of. The first option is to not upgrade your capital ships until you get the tech monitor. So you have a couple of options to think of. The first option is to not upgrade your capital ships until you get the tech monitor, and then you can upgrade both unit types and switch the production method of your military shipyards. The next option is to just import man of wars or ironclads. If you use this option, it's probably best to switch the production method of your military shipyards to produce ironclads and import the man of wars. Man of wars will be more readily available on the trade market than ironclads. The third option you have is to build a second military shipyards and have one produce ironclads and one produce man of wars. With our example of Great Britain here, that's not such a big deal. We're a large country, we have a large navy, and we're going to need more than one military shipyards anyway. But if you're a smaller country, or you have a smaller navy, making two military shipyards in two different states might not be the most efficient thing. Your best bet is to probably just wait until you research Monitor to upgrade, unless you have a good import option for man of wars. Something to keep in mind when upgrading your navies is that unlike when you upgrade armies, navies have to be in your HQ in order to upgrade. They can't be in a sea node. For example, our Navy Plymouth Station is in the England HQ, right here. Let's say it were in this sea node for the English Channel. If you hit the upgrade button on either unit, it'll just stay the way it is until you bring the Navy to one of your HQs. So if you hit the upgrade button and you notice your Navy isn't upgraded, it's probably because you haven't stationed the Navy in an HQ yet. The Naval Base is the building that houses your navies, just like the barracks houses your armies. On this screen, you'll see the input goods and the wages and the production methods. When looking at the employment, you'll find it's the same as with armies. There are two types of employees, officers and servicemen. Servicemen are the lower rung of military employee and hire from the lower classes. Officers are the higher rung of employee, and they hire from the middle or upper classes, or promote from existing servicemen. Just as with the Army, if you're having problems hiring in your naval base, this screen will tell you something about not having enough qualifications. What this really means is you don't have enough pops from your primary culture to employ as officers. To be an officer, you need a very high level of acceptance for your culture. So you really need to hire from the primary culture. If you pass multiculturalism, this will change, but until then, you need to hire from the primary culture. So think about what pops you have in a state before you create flotillas there. The state of home countries has the trait London Docklands. This is a state modifier you'll find in various states around the world. They'll all be called something different, but they all have the same benefits. They're all essentially the same. If you have something like this in your state, you want to build your military shipyards and your naval bases here first. You see, you get a plus 15% military shipyards building throughput bonus on the military shipyards building, and you can build 15 more flotillas in this state than you can in others. It's always best to house your Navy industry in states like this first. When not in war, there's nothing you really need to do with your Navy. When you are in war, your navies are doing one of three things: fighting enemy navies, raiding convoys, or protecting your convoys. When you click on the orders for this commander, you'll see the breakdown of what they can do. Interception and coordinated interception mean this general is looking to begin naval battles with enemy navies. So if you have this order set, you can send this navy to a sea node that has an enemy navy, and eventually the two navies will begin a naval battle. The last two orders, escort convoys and organized merchant convoys, tell the general to protect your convoys in a sea node. When you look at the map, all the way zoomed out, you see that some sea nodes are golden and others are a faded gray. The golden sea nodes are the ones that you have convoys going through for your trade routes. The ones in gray, you don't have any convoys going through there. When you're in war, if you have trade routes that are an important import for the war, like maybe you need to import small arms to cover the cost of supplying your armies, you'll need to protect those trade routes in order to keep your armies supplied. So looking at the trade screen here for Great Britain, you'll see the 4 routes they currently have going. The map is highlighting all the sea nodes we're using for these 4 routes. If you put your mouse over the coffee icon, you'll see the map now highlights which specific nodes this trade route is using. If we click on the sea node for Macronesian Sea, you'll see the specifics for what goods we have going through this route and how many convoys it's costing us if you click the pull-down menu here. You also see the list of things marked as port connection. What this means is, for example, in order for New South Wales to stay connected to the British market, it uses this sea node to connect to the market. When in war, if an enemy navy took control of this sea node, they would disrupt this connection and would cut New South Wales off from the British market. So what this means to you in war is, let's say you have something like small arms going through this sea node. You might want to put a navy there and give the commander the order to escort your convoys so that you don't lose access to that trade route. Vice versa, if your enemy has a trade route of small arms going through this sea node, you can set your naval commander to raid convoys, and when you put them in the sea node, they will disrupt this trade route, thus cutting your enemy off from the vital resource. You can scroll to any of the countries here and see what goods they have going through this sea node. This is how you use navies in war. Now, sometimes the amount of sea nodes you're using for a route are just too many to have a navy in each node. For example, if we look at the trade route for opium with Great Qing, you're not going to be able to put a navy in each of these sea nodes. So what you're really doing is you're going to have one navy that is going to protect your convoys, and during war, keep an eye on where your opponent's navies are going and move your navy accordingly to disrupt their convoy raiding. Raiding your enemy's convoys is a great way to end a war quickly. Remember, when an army is not getting the goods it needs, it lowers their morale recovery. When an army doesn't have morale, they retreat from a battle much quicker. So cutting an enemy off from their resources can result in you winning battles much quicker. Let's talk about supply routes, because this is one of the issues you always run into when in war and can make or break a war. For this, we're going to look at a Germany run I'm doing. Just like when you're trading, when you're fighting a war, you need to transport resources. If you're fighting a war over land, then you don't need convoys. If you're fighting a war overseas, you need to transport the resources the army needs using convoys. So let's say I were in a war with France. The front would be here on the border. And if I sent an army here, they can be supplied overland and we wouldn't need convoys. However, one of the wars I'm in with this run is a war between Great Britain and Mascara. I'm on the side of Mascara, and Austria is on our side as well. I currently have armies in Mascara, one in the Macronesian Sea node, and one over here traveling to the West Indies front. The two armies in Mascara are not on a front. They are stationed in the North Africa HQ. When an army is in an HQ, you don't need convoys to supply them. However, this army, the 9th German Army, is on its way to the West Indies front. Since we're sending this army overseas, we need to use convoys to supply them. Just like with a trade route, If we put our mouse cursor over the army, we'll see which sea nodes are being used to supply this army. It's using 8 sea nodes from the Eastern Caribbean Sea, which is this one, all the way to the Central Mediterranean Sea, which is this one. This is because Austria is on our side of the war. The army will use a route that will require the least number of sea nodes. If our army tried to travel itself from one of the sea nodes near us, it would take more than 8. So if this army were in our German HQ and we sent it to the West Indies front, you would see the army travel south through Austria and enter at the Central Mediterranean Sea and travel all the way to the West Indies front. If you click on any of these sea nodes the army is using, you'll see a breakdown of the convoys it needs. So let's click on the Eastern Caribbean Sea node. So you'll see some trade routes that we're using, but if you scroll down here, you'll see one of the items listed is the 9th German Army. We can see that this army needs 387 convoys to stay supplied while at the West Indies front. Let's see how it calculates that. The number of convoys you'll need is based on how many battalions you're sending and how many sea nodes they go through. So you can see here we're sending 34 battalions through 8 sea nodes. At base cost, we need 340 convoys. 34 battalions times the base cost of 10. We're passing through 8 sea nodes, so you have a cost multiplier of 0.1 for every sea node past the first one, so a total cost multiplier of 1.7. So you multiply 340 convoys times 1.7, and you get 578 convoys. However, we get a benefit from one of our general's effects, and this number gets lowered by multiplying it by 0.6. And this gives you the final convoy cost of 387. Now, one of the problems with this 0.6 number right here is that the game truncates the number. So if you actually multiply 578 by 0.6, you'd get 346.8 convoys. That's because the actual number is 0.669550173. But the game just displays it as 0.6. This is just if you're doing the math at home and you're like, oh, what the hell? This is how you determine how many convoys you're going to need if you send armies around the world. Let's take our army of 90 battalions stationed in the North Africa HQ. Even though they're stationed here, the number of sea nodes it goes through is still going to be 8 because we need to supply it from our home HQ. Just like the 9th German Army, this army needs 8 sea nodes to supply it. So now we have 90 battalions going through 8 sea nodes. So let's send it to the West Indies front. You'll see our number of convoys went down drastically. Let's look at the sea node again. You can look at any node along its route, so let's take a look at the Atlantic Ocean sea node. So when we look at the list, we see the army we just sent, and we see that it's costing us 1,020 convoys. So 90 battalions times a base cost of 10, which is 900 convoys, going through 8 sea nodes. So an additional cost of 1.7, which is 1,530 convoys, minus the commander supply efficiency of 0.6, though we know the actual number is 0.669550173, which gives you 1,024 convoys. So you can see we really don't have enough convoys to supply this many armies going that far away. This is also why convoy raiding is so important during war. If you sink your opponent's convoys, you also severely hamper their ability to send their armies overseas. They can send the army, but that army will pretty much not be able to recover any morale, and so the armies they send will retreat from battle very quickly. One final thing to note about navies and the benefit they have for you is that navies really add a lot to your prestige score. You see here how the prestige score is calculated, and one of them is Navy power projection. You can see here we're getting more overall from the Army, but that's because we have such a large Army and a relatively small Navy in this Germany run. But you get more prestige from your Navy power projection than your Army power projection in general. Remember, the higher your prestige, the higher your world rank. The higher your rank, the lower your interest rate is. So you can draw a direct line from the size and power of your Navy to how much interest you'll pay if you go into debt. Navies can cost a lot of money, but they can also save you a lot of money depending on how much debt you're in. Like I'm currently in my offline Germany run here of $50 million, unfortunately. I hope this video was helpful to you. Again, if you haven't watched the first part about the Army, check that video out with the link in the description. If there are aspects of the game you'd like me to make more videos about, comment with your suggestions below. Otherwise, thank you for watching and be awesome.